What are your night shift horror stories?
Worked a parking garage at the airport. Cleaning the top deck and noticed about 100 ravens all over a truck with a tarp over the bed. Took my flashlight expecting something awful. Noticed as I got closer the smell and the ravens taking turns going in a hole they had torn open and popping out covered in gunk. Some guy left a broke down beater with a couple animal carcasses in the back to rot. No heads. Checked the logs and the damn truck had been there since November and it was April, so everything was just thawing and breaking down.
I used to work night shift as a care aide in an old folks' home. It was already creepy. The home was an old hospital that was converted. Some asshole kept walking around the courtyard after dark dressed as the Grim Reaper knocking on doors. It was actually really scary. He ran off and the facility got a security guard for a few weeks.
Was an orderly in a hospital. Two of us were sitting in the basement office adjacent to the morgue. A guy passed our office, looking at us a little shifty, came back again and asked if we had access to the morgue. We said yes, thinking he was doing a pickup for a funeral home, but that seemed strange given it was around 12 to 12:30 a.m. Nope. He wanted to pay us to let him in, and leave him alone with the bodies for an hour. We escorted him up to security. Apparently he had tried it in the past, as security knew him.
Was running the register at 24 Hours Supermarket. Stock person comes running into produce carrying mop handle screaming "You motherfucker." Out of sight, he keeps yelling "fucker" and smacking handle at something, for like 5 minutes. I am ringing up customers and freaking out because he was losing his mind, but I am not interested in getting involved in a murder, so I ignore it. Later I find out he was chasing a rat.
This didn't become a horror story until recently, but as a teen, I used to close down the gas station/truck stop I worked at, alone. My boss used to pop up out of the shadows as I was closing down the till with the backup lights on. He'd be super calm and act like it wasn't creepy at 11 p.m. when he should be home with his family. He was even at my high school graduation. He and his wife's number is still in my phone. Anyhow, he is currently on trial for murdering a prostitute via stabbing her to death, back in '94. Cold case potentially solved via DNA and modern science.
Did hospital security for about 2 months. It was small hospital out in the sticks, so we were responsible for removing patients who had passed from their rooms and transferring into the morgue freezer. We had just brought a decedent to the morgue and right before we were about to transfer them to the freezer their cell phone rang. Granted, pretty tame compared to some stories, but at the time it gave us a decent fright.
Many years ago I briefly had a job that started at 3:30 a.m. The job itself was very boring, but the commute was wild. The world is at its weirdest in the very early morning. Road hazards haven't been called in yet, so one day I pulled off the freeway and discovered that the off-ramp was completely flooded, deep enough that I have no idea how my car didn't stall. But the most interesting discovery was that if law enforcement has to raid a home, they do it around 3 or 4 in the morning because that's the best chance of everyone being peacefully asleep. One day I was nearly to work when I noticed something off ahead of me. I slowed down and came up to a massive police blockade, squad cars everywhere and absolutely crawling with heavily armed officers, but all in absolute silence. They silently waved me down a side street. Just a creepy, unsettling experience.
Leaving one night from work I was followed by a log truck, and it kept going faster and faster, until I was at 100 miles per hour. I pulled off as the truck blew past my car rocking it. Thing was there was twisty turns ahead. Couldn't find the truck. Update: no, he wasn't experiencing brake failure, this was on an uphill which the route is slow and progressively uphill. I'm not on the Grapevine or 4th of July pass. It was just hauling ass. They were running bobtail. Usually if a truck loses brakes the driver would probably engage engine brakes and downshift.
I worked in a residential treatment center for teen girls. One girl with some severe trauma, rape, abuse, came sleepwalking into the room screaming to please untie her while clawing at her wrists. She was begging me to help her because he's torturing me. I sat her down and pulled her bracelets and watch off. She went completely limp, then got up and went back to bed. It freaked me out seeing the raw emotion of her trauma since she was always smiling and relatively calm during the day. Another time I was doing my nightly checks and a guy suddenly walked out from behind the door coming at me. I screamed and threw my flashlight at him. It was a smiley face balloon.
Work in the winter for me is plowing and snow removal. It was late and I had been out for over 24 hours at this point. Pulled over into a small cul-de-sac with the nearest house being over a 100 yards away so I could let the truck stay on so I could stay warm. 6 will make things loud. As I'm nodding off, there was a very loud bang and it felt like someone then pulled on my driver's side door handle. Luckily, I always lock my truck doors. I immediately threw on every strobe/rear/headlight and started looking around, and I saw absolutely nothing. It scared the shit out of me. Needless to say, I never sleep anywhere other than lit parking lots now.
More of a very weird event. Sometimes work night shifts. One time was going home around 4 a.m. or so. It was pitch dark outside and very quiet. Person on a bike came out of nowhere, said he remembered me from middle school, even said the right school name and rode off.
Worked as an evening manager at a major Hilton property. Got a complaint from a bunch of guests about the noise coming from one of the rooms. Turns out, a drunken man was beating the shit out of his wife, and had the door barricaded so we couldn't get in. I called the cops, and they had to get into the room using the balcony from the next room over. I'm still traumatized by what I saw when they finally arrested him and got the wife out of the room. She was covered in blood. It was horrifying.
Used to work night shift at a 24-hour Walmart. Customers are nuts enough in the daytime, but they become weird after midnight. Once had an elderly guy come in wearing only a jean jacket and fishnet stockings. He came up to my register, leaned in, and asked if we carried anything to get rid of lice. Those plastic barriers all stores have now to protect cashiers? They need to keep those even after the pandemic ends. I lost count of the times customers got into my personal space to ask about products for fleas, lice, rashes, etc.
Was walking through the simulation lab for nursing students at the hospital I work at on very little sleep. All the lights were off, and it was my first time working night shift. Turned a corner and saw what I thought was a person standing behind a lamp that was on. Turns out it was a mannequin holding the pull cord. Really freaked me out, and I was awake after that.
Worked at a distress center almost 10 years ago. Was on the 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. shift. Got about 2 phone calls each hour of the shift from the same guy saying that he's tied up in a room, his balls are tied up with leather straps, and his wife is getting banged by 5 giant black guys in the other room. Asked him each time if he's in distress and he says no every time. Kept telling him if he's not in distress then he shouldn't be calling and let him go. I just can't believe he was up from 12 to 6 a.m. to make those calls.
I was closing supervisor at a grocery store and someone managed to shit between the bathroom and the exit doors at 8:59. We close at 9 o'clock. You'd think, oh, there's literal shit on the floor, surely people will walk around it. No, instead they continue to plow through it, so now there's shit on multiple grocery carts. The exit is scattered with feces, there's shit on people's shoes undoubtedly, and there's shit in the parking lot. Luckily for me, my less squeamish supervisor working with me that closing night volunteered to mop up the exit and bathroom, which to our surprise had also been shit on. For the record, human shit makes me immediately gag and vomit when I get a whiff of it, so I ended up puking in the trash next to the shit exit.
I was working the Christmas Eve night shift in my local emergency department. The clock struck 4 a.m. on Christmas morning and the emergency buzzer sounded. A 74-year-old male patient had gone into a sudden cardiac arrest. The buzzer wasn't working properly, so we couldn't locate where exactly in the department it was coming from. Once we finally figured it out, we got in there and I took over chest compressions. A team of anesthetists, nurses, doctors, and 20 minutes later, we managed to get him back for just long enough for his family to come and say goodbye to him. What a shitty Christmas.
Working late at my office/workshop one night. I'm doing analyses that take a while to run, so I tend to snack and watch Netflix, or try and do another mundane task that needs to just run by itself. This is a big building, but I'm in the basement where no one goes, and the aircon shuts off at night with little ventilation so it gets warm. And #X200B, the horror story was more for the security guard that walked in on me, a 2 m tall man, with no shirt on, heavily tattooed, eating cereal at like 3 a.m. walking around. I could never look him in the eye after that.
Working third shift security at a condo, and a mother left the bathroom to check on their mac and cheese. Her 2-year-old drowned in the tub. Once the police were done, my boss called me and told me I had to go talk to the family and find out what happened, even though we knew from the police telling us. My daughter was about 2 at the time. It broke my heart to even hear the story from the guy I relieved. And then I had to go ask the family to tell some Dumas Rente cop about it as well.
For a change of pace, here's a nice one. I was taking my break outside, and a little mouse came up to me, so I gave him a bit of pot noodle, and he sat on the floor next to me munching away on it.
What an excellent time to read this, at 2:42 a.m., completely alone in the 8th floor of the building because I'm the only person in the night shift, smiley face.
I work at a hotel in the middle of city, and I was on the overnight front desk shift when me and my valet at the time realized there was a man in one of the guest rooms that was prior occupied. We called the police and found that the guests upstairs hog-tied him, so he was escorted out. Nothing too crazy, stuff like that happens all the time in a hotel like this. But we had the 3 lowest floors of the hotel shut down due to low occupancy during COVID-19. We soon discovered he was caught in the guest's room after trying to open every door from the floor up, seeing if it was unlocked or propped open slightly. He was staying in one of our vacant rooms on the low floor unknown to us, for a week, stealing food from the mini bar and banquet halls. We watched him on the security cameras on the lower floors walking around the halls every night, but naked and videoing himself.
My nightmare came from my partner doing night shift. He was swapping from days to nights constantly with only a day to try and adjust his sleep cycle in between, mining. It took the biggest toll on his well-being to the point he was telling me he was just going to run his car off the road on his way to his next swing. He could barely string a sentence together. Messing with your circadian rhythm is no joke. I can only imagine how many years he's shaved off his life in the long run.
Night shift nurse picked up the phone about 2 a.m., don't panic, but recognized it as one of the C-suite's voices. I was immediately worried. There's an electrical issue in the something-another closet. There's a chance it may explode. You need to evacuate all patients from the area. Just me and one other nurse with 5 moms, their 5 babies, and however many visitors. We quickly jumped into our own little, panic-driven task force. We had packed up enough diapers, wipes, formula, water, snacks, and blankets to be evacuated for a week, LOL. Happy to report it didn't explode and all was back to normal by 7 a.m. day shift. There's plenty of horror stories from creepy things happening, or just not having enough staff during bad deliveries. But this one has always stood out in my memory.
Worked as a security guard, did a week-long gig working from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. during setup, and the 3 days of the concert itself. First had a plague of locusts during setup, then on the second night of the concert one of my supervisors got targeted by a drunk patron who he kicked out earlier. The guy punched him so hard knocked his orbital socket loose. Finally, on the 3rd night, just when I thought things were calming down, we had the worst mass shooting in U.S. history take place. I had to keep 6 people from bleeding out till cops arrived in my area backstage about an hour and a half later.
My buddy and I were in the guard shack on an important entry point, like 100% ID checks, can't be expired, gotta double check against a list put out even if the IDs are valid, so if you're not on the list your ID doesn't mean shit. It's around 3 a.m., and we're watching creepy YouTube videos during the time that nobody is coming through. He looks up and shouts, "What the fuck?" I look up and scream like a little girl, and nearly jump out of my chair. Dollar store Jason Momoa was just face pressed against the glass, grinning, and once he scared the shit out of us he laughed and walked in. Dude was as big as Jason Momoa and pretty similar looking, I mean dollar store version of him. 10 minutes later, after we calmed down, I looked at him and asked, "Wait, did he even show an ID?" No, he did not, LMAO.